Her name is Bessie Coleman. Her occupation was a pilot. Her birth date was January 26, 1892. Her place of birth was Atlanta, Texas. Her nicknames were Brave Bessie, Queen Bess, but her full name was Elizabeth Coleman. Bessie Coleman lived through 3 periods in history during her life. The first one being World War I and the post-war. As a direct result of the First World War, over 16 million people across the world lost their lives. Aside from this massive loss of life, the world felt the aftermath of the war in their pockets, with national economies taking a big hit. Women had joined the workforce during the war and decided to stay there once the fighting was over. And finally, political lines were redrawn, making the world a very different place than it had been prior to the war. She also lived through the Roaring Twenties. At the end of World War I, soldiers returned to the United States and Canada with wartime wages and many new products on the market on which to spend. At first, the recession of wartime production caused a brief but deep recession known as the post-World War I recession. Quickly, however, the U.S. and the Canadian economies rebounded as returning soldiers re-entered the labor force and many factories were retooled to produce consumer goods. The Roaring Twenties was a period of sustained economic prosperity with a distinctive cultural edge in many major cities during the 1920s. It occurred in the United States, Canada, and Europe. It emphasized the era's social, artistic, and cultural dynasty. Jazz music blossomed, and the Flappers redefined modern womanhood and art decor. Economically, the era saw a large-scale use of automobiles, telephones, motion pictures, electricity, and industrial growth. The media focused on celebrities, especially sports heroes and movie stars. Also in major countries, women won the right to vote during the 1920s. This era was also known as the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age was a cultural movement that took place in America during the 1920s, from which both jazz music and dance emerged. This movement coincided with both the equally impressive introduction of mainstream radio and the conclusion of World War I. The birth of jazz music is often accredited to African Americans, though it soon expanded to America's Caucasian middle class. Jazz, therefore, was characterized by a blending of African American traditions and the ideals with Caucasian middle-class society. Cities like New York and Chicago were hotbeds for jazz, especially for black artists. African Americans' jazz was played more frequently on urban radio stations than on its suburban counterparts. The youth of the 1920s were influenced by jazz to rebel against the traditional culture of previous generations. Although this era ended with the Great Depression, which victimized America in the 1930s, jazz has lived on in Americans' pop culture. Bessie Coleman was one of the 13 children to Susan and George Coleman, who both worked as sharecroppers. Her father was a Native American and African American descent, and left the family in search of better opportunities in Oklahoma when Bessie was a child. Her mother did her best to support the family, and the children contributed as soon as they were old enough to. In 1915, at the age of 23, Coleman moved to Chicago, where she lived with her brothers and worked as a minarchist. Not long after her move to Chicago, she began listening to and reading stories about World War I pilots, which sparked her interest in being a pilot. However, she faced a double stigma in that dream, being both African American and a woman. So she set her sights on France in order to reach her goals and to begin studying in French. In 1920, Coleman crossed the ocean with all her savings and the financial support of Robert Abbott, one of the first African American millionaires. Over the next 7 months, she learned to fly, and in June 1921, the Fédération Aéronautique Nationale awarded her an international pilot's license. Coleman performed at numerous air shows over the next 5 years, performing heart-thrilling stunts, encouraging other African Americans to pursue flying and to refuse to perform anywhere blacks were not permitted. To find out what happened with her last flight in 1926, you must read this wonderful book.